Howdy and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Bringing us in, as always, with their rendition of Eno Mariconis for a few dollars more is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar slingers like you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. In tonight's podcast, the Cowboys vs Nazi action continues in Chapter 24 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trent Tano. Can't wait to get your Cowboys vs Nazi on? Then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available at Society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And as always, we'd like to give a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. So without further ado, here is Chapter 24 of Paris High Noon.
Chapter 24. Just the way Butch would have done it. Catfish, St. Jude, and Goose had a time slipping past the German patrols once they returned to Paris. It seemed to Catfish they were pulling camp just in time. The outlaws made their way to the hideout through St. Jude's secret entrance. When they reached the wall of bones, Catfish smelled shit and blood. St. Jude used his electric torch to scan the pile. A big pair of black boots stuck out in the weak light. St. Jude pulled out his automatic and ran down the tunnel to the hideout. Goose and Catfish close on his heels in the glow of the campfire sat Jean. "Are you okay?" St. Jude asked. "What in the hell is going on?" Jean stared at the fire and kept his mouth tight for a long minute. "Louis," Jean said. "He killed Barnaby. He tried to..." Catfish and Goose came into the hideout. Catfish took a good look around. "That son of a bitch," St. Jude said. Jean told him what happened in a shaking voice that grew more hard and firm as he came to the part about his showdown with Louis. "I dumped his body down a hole," Jean said. "I hope the rats get sick off his corpse." Catfish put his hand on Jean. "He was a bad one. We made the right choice." St. Jude kicked an empty wine bottle against the temple wall. "I should have shot the bastard back at the Spanish border." He looked down at his little brother and gave a knowing nod. Jean had stood his ground with a bad hombre and come out on top. Jean looked up at Catfish. This was the fourth man he killed, and he didn't know how to feel. With Sargent back at the Happy Flower Cafe and the other two outside of Gassé, he reacted out of fear and instinct. This time it had been up close and very personal. Jean was filled with such a hot rage that it spilled out when he squeezed the trigger. Now with that hot feeling gone, he just felt cold and tired. Catfish gave Jean's shoulder a squeeze. "Put it out of your mind, son. We got a long stretch ahead of us, but soon it will be all over." Catfish started in on the meeting with the SOE agents and the plan to hold up the train to break Hiccup out. Of course, now they were down 2 guns. "I'm going to need Moo's help. You think she can handle it?" Moo sat behind her curtain in the alcove, her head in her hands. She was dirty and bloody from Louis's assault. Her body ached and she had torn one fingernail clean off. Jean had tried to dress her wounds, but she was so frazzled that she yelled at him to keep away from her. After Jean had killed Louis, Moo wanted to bolt out of the hideout and run back to Richard. But she saw the same look in Jean's wide eyes that she'd seen in Richard's when he blew Lana's brains out. So she stayed. She listened to Catfish and for the stamping of jackboots. The SS posse might storm the hideout any minute. She wanted to take back what she'd done to Jean, but she also despised him for riding with a murdering rapist in the first place. Moo was stuck with her Judas choice, and whether she confessed to Jean or went back to Richard, she would find herself in the same spot at another man's mercy. Now these men were discussing her as if she weren't there, wondering what she could handle, as if any of them had ever had to endure what she just survived. Moo tore down the curtain and screamed. The gang turned around as if lightning had just struck deep inside the old temple. "Are you all insane?" Moo shouted. Her fists were balled up and her body trembled. She looked over at Catfish. "You're going to get us all killed. And for what? So you can go on living with yourself?" Catfish's head dropped. Jean got up and tried to put his arms around her. "Don't worry," Jean said. "I won't let anything happen to you." Moo pushed Jean away. "And how have you protected me so far? It was only dumb luck that you came back when you did. You left me alone and that rapist, your fellow Le Bon Sauvage." Moo looked over at the gang. "That's what you all are. Killers and worse. No better than the Boche." "Moo, please." "I took care of Louis." Jean pulled out his revolver. He held it firm in his hand as he approached her. "I can take care of anything that comes our way." Moo looked at the revolver. "You think you can solve everything with a gun? Ever since you came back, you've been showing that gun off like it's your second pecker. You think strutting around with a pistol tucked in your trousers makes you a man? Well, let me tell you something, Jean Malheur. You're still a boy, and it will be a sad day when someone depends on you." The gun in Jean's hand started to shake. "You don't know what you're talking about. If it wasn't for Catfish, the boss back at the cafe would have killed me and done worse to you." Moo grabbed the gun in Jean's hand. "Give me the gun." She pulled on it, but it was firm in his grip. "If that's all it takes to be safe, then give it to me. I won't need you anymore. I won't need any of you murderers anymore." St. Jude stepped in between them, shoving Moo back up against the wall while pushing Jean away. "Fuck all this." St. Jude shoved an MP40 into Moo's arms. "You want a gun? Here. Have at it. Go kill a couple of Boche if you're so inclined. At least then you'll be useful." Jean walked up to his brother, the gun shaking in his hand. "St. Jude, this isn't about you. It's..." "Oh, shut the hell up, Jean." He grabbed Jean's shirt and pulled him in close, face to face. "You want to fuck her? Then fuck her and leave her. The last thing this gang needs is some crazy bitch who can't make a decision about her own goddamn life." St. Jude let Jean go and pointed his finger at Moo. "Now you can run off. Shit, you can gun us all down and take our heads to the Boche and collect the reward. But let me tell you one thing, sister. You won't get far, and it'll only be a matter of time before the Boche don't find you useful anymore. So go ahead. Moo, go ahead and send us to hell. We're going there anyways. Just quit wasting our time." The submachine gun shook in Moo's hands. Tears started to streak down her cheek. Sean looked at Moo and then his brother. St. Jude walked past Catfish on his way back to the fire. Catfish came up to Moo and put his hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to be scared. Hell, we're all scared. But these are scary times. You're going to have to do something that you haven't done in a long time, and that's trust a stranger. Now, what we're about to do is dangerous, but everyone here has signed on for it voluntarily. You don't have to join us, but we could use your help. Come with us, and the British Army will be backing you from here on out." She nodded and held the gun to her bosom. The old cowboy's eyes were soft in the low firelight. If only he knew what she had done. Catfish's eyes might not be so kind. Maybe, she hoped, if Richard never got her note, neither he nor Jean would ever find out. Goose led the gang through the catacombs, reaching the outskirts of Paris after midnight. From here, Catfish took the lead. They reached the stables at Le Pin before dawn broke. Catfish, St. Jude, and Jean rustled the horses, while Goose and Moo gathered the saddles and gear. They rode out, taking the hills and ridges north of the Marne River. Catfish led the way on a chestnut mare, although this mount didn't compare to the Arabian. She was sure-footed with lots of wind. For the sake of time, they risked riding through the forest and the woods during the day. Sunlight flickered through the leaves and the wind bit their skin. Branches threatened to knock them off their saddles while the horses broke their way through the bramble. Just after midnight, they reached the rendezvous point on the outskirts of Miao. Bonnie was waiting for them, along with the man who gave the stink eye back at the hospital. "Glad to see you made it," Bonnie said. "This is Sergeant Connor, my radioman." St. Jude looked at the squat sergeant. "We've met." Catfish introduced Goose, Moo, and Jean. After a quick hello, Bonnie noticed the number of Le Bon Sauvage had been whittled down. "Looks like you're missing two." "Sometimes we can't choose the men who partner up with us, much to our detriment," Catfish said. "Do you think we can still pull this off?" Bonnie asked Catfish. Catfish bit his lower lip. Back when he rode with Butch and the Wild Bunch, it only took a half a dozen seasoned outlaws and gunmen to pull off a train robbery. Now, once again, he was taking a green crew and putting them in a situation that could get them killed. Catfish was afraid what happened at the bank in Argenton would repeat itself along the Marne. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was going to die. Only one way to find out. The wind carried the thunder of the horses down the valley. The sky was clear, filled with stars and the late summer moon. The Marne River cut through the green valley where the bridge crossed it on steel trusses. By 2 a.m, they were set. St. Jude wiped the sweat off his brow. It had been a chore to stack up the pile of rocks on the tracks. "I thought we were going to jump on the train. Isn't that how you cowboys robbed them?" Catfish chuckled, keeping his eyes on the track. Bonnie said the train was leaving Paris at midnight. It was already closing in on 3. "If I were to jump on a moving train, my knees would break and you would all fall off. Trust me. The engineer will have no choice but to stop." "And what if the prick decides to keep going on down the line?" St. Jude said. "Well," Catfish said, "he could keep going. But when that cow catcher hits this pile, the wheels will jump the track, sending everyone down into the river." St. Jude looked down at the rolling dark waters of the Marne, and then at the pile of stones and logs. One way or the other, he was going to see what kind of man was behind the steam. St. Jude wouldn't have to wait long. Chugging from the east side of the valley, the train's giant headlight cut through the darkness. Catfish gave an owl's hoot. On top of a knoll that overlooked the bridge, Sergeant Connor manned the big MG-34 with Goose ready to feed belts of ammo into its hungry chamber. Moo was down the cut with the horses. That left Catfish, Bonnie, St. Jude, and Jean to take on a train full of soldiers. The odds were long, but for an outlaw, they always are. When Catfish gave the signal, Jean was still with Moo and the horses. He'd promised he would stay with her until he couldn't, and now that time had come. Moo clutched the MP40. Jean gave her a quick and dirty lesson on using it. "Switch the safety up," he said. "Keep the gun close to your hips and use the center of your body to aim. Got it?" "Oui," Moo said, but the gun shook in her arms. An owl call hooted through the night, and the horses started to nicker. Jean put his hand on Moo's shoulder. "Don't worry. You'll be okay. Anything happens to us, you follow Goose and the SOE men. They'll get you to London." Jean looked down at Moo. Even under the trees, the starlight cast her brown eyes like a pair of phantoms. "Please," Moo said. Her hands went to touch his face, but instead hooked over the red scarf around her neck. Sean wanted to kiss her right then and there, tell her it was going to be all right. Kiss her and tell her he loved her, but he didn't. "Don't worry," was all he could say. Sean climbed up the cut to the tracks. Catfish chuckled lightly when he saw him. "Get lost?" Bonnie and St. Jude chuckled as well. St. Jude smirked. "So, did you kiss her?" Sean blushed and said nothing. St. Jude wrapped his arm around Jean. "Don't worry, little brother. I'll see to it that you get a second chance." The train chugged up the grade towards the bridge. Catfish had the boys slip under the trestles just below the tracks. As soon as the train hit the bridge, the engineer saw the pile of logs and boulders. He blew the whistle and slammed on the brakes. The bridge itself was under 100 yards, but the big iron wheels needed all the track they could get to avoid plowing into the obstacle. Inside the coaches, men were thrown together, while guns, boxes, and loose equipment flew around them. Even poor Hiccup, locked and chained in a small cell with the other prisoners, was tossed up against the iron bars. Before the soldiers had time to collect themselves, Connor opened up with the machine gun, raking the passenger coaches, avoiding the freight coach that held the prisoners. Catfish leapt up to the engineer's box and stuck the barrel of the peacemaker at the engineer's street-white face. Catfish leapt up to the engineer's box and stuck the barrel of the peacemaker at the engineer's sheet-white face. The engineer threw up his hands. "Please don't shoot." Sean stuck the barrel of the MP40 in the fireman's back. "Ease back slowly." Bonnie and St. Jude jumped up and tied up the crew. Catfish looked at the controls of the old steam engine and grew misty. Although now thought of as ancient technology by combustible engine standards, in Catfish's youth, a steam train was the most marvelous invention humanity had ever produced. A fire-breathing, steam-belly beast filled with valves, spigots, and gauges that cut through the wild plains and high mountains of the Wild West like a prophecy of what was to come. "This has to be one of the prettiest trains I've ever robbed," Catfish said to the engineer, who had a hard time understanding Catfish's French. It then occurred to him that he was being held up by the old cowboy. "You're welcome, Monsieur Cowboy," the engineer said, and would have tipped his hat if his hands weren't tied behind his back. "Don't thank me just yet," Catfish said. "You and the fireman sit still. I don't think the Boche will kill you, but I can't guarantee it. You could let us go." "If you boys were to run, they'd kill you for sure," Catfish handed St. Jude the satchel of dynamite. "All right, lead the way." St. Jude took the satchel, but had his doubts. "Are you sure you want me to handle the TNT? Last time I lit the fuse, we almost went to see the Creator. I figure on giving another competent bandit a try." St. Jude nodded and led the rest of the gang over the top of the coal bin. Every now and then a stray bullet from the machine gun whizzed past, causing them to hunch and quicken their pace. Underneath, the soldiers were knocking out the windows with the butts of their rifles and returning fire. Their blood was so hot and their ears pounding so fiercely from the gunfire in the enclosed space. Underneath, the soldiers were knocking out the windows with the butts of their rifles and returning fire. Their blood was so hot and their ears pounding so fiercely from the gunfire in the enclosed space, they didn't hear the outlaws tromping on top of the coaches. Once they crossed the first 4 passenger cars, Bonnie noticed the freight car. "That's the one." "Are you sure?" St. Jude asked. "You want to go down and ask?" Catfish said. St. Jude didn't reply. More bullets ripped around them. "We can't stay on top of these cars," Sean said. St. Jude tried to think. When nothing came to mind, he decided to act. He lay flat on the roof of the car and poked his head down. No one was shooting from the coach, Bonnie pointed out, but if he was wrong and they blew the top off, then they couldn't cross it to get to the right one. "This will have to do," St. Jude said. He shoved a quarter stick inside a ventilation hood and lit the fuse. They ran to the next coach and lay flat on their bellies. The blast blew a big hole on top of the freight car, knocking down the guards who were looking out of the small window at the raging gunfight. Inside their small cells, the prisoners were knocked onto their backs. St. Jude looked to Jean. "Your turn." Smoke and debris wafted up through the hole, along with a strong smell of cordite and sulfur that made Jean think he was about to jump into hell. He tied the rope to the handbrake. Smoke and debris wafted up through the hole, along with a strong smell of cordite and sulfur that made Jean think he was about to jump into hell. He tied the rope to the handbrake, and he and Bonnie shimmied down. Bonnie hit the ground and put a burst from the MP40 into the heads of the guards. Jean took the keys and unlocked the cages. He and Bonnie helped the stunned prisoners to their feet. "This is a rescue," Bonnie said. He grabbed one of the prisoners, a dignified-looking man whose face was red and purple. In all, there were about 4 prisoners. "Which one of you is Hiccup?" Jean said. "Here," Hiccup said. Jean grabbed him and dragged him to the hole in the roof. Catfish and St. Jude each grabbed one of Hiccup's arms and pulled him up top. Hiccup looked up at Catfish and smiled a weak but grateful smile. It was the same smile Lee had before Catfish left him in the shell hole. A smile of mortality and friendship. Catfish held Hiccup in his arms. The tears leaked out of the old cowboy's eyes as he returned the smile. Couldn't leave a pard behind. Bonnie and Jean helped the last 3 prisoners up and over the top of the coach. It was all over in 5 minutes. The prisoners and the outlaws hunched on their hands and knees on the roof of the freight car. The reports of 1,000 guns going off at once echoed across the valley. "That's all of them," Bonnie said. St. Jude slapped a fresh magazine into the submachine gun. "Good. Now let's get the hell out of here." Bonnie picked up the dapper prisoners while Catfish hoisted Hiccup up, giving his pard a shoulder to lean on. Jean looked at the other 2 prisoners. "Can you walk?" They nodded. "Follow me," Jean said. And he led the way over the coaches toward the engine. The 2 prisoners followed slowly, while Catfish and Bonnie made a good pace with their burdens. St. Jude rode drag close behind. Suddenly down the tracks came a long burst from a train whistle. Chugging up from behind them was a fast-moving diesel locomotive carrying 2 freight coaches. The outlaws looked on as the lone headlight got larger and brighter. A grinding sound of steel on steel filled their ears that sounded like the devil sharpening his pitchfork. St. Jude turned to look. "What the hell is it?" Catfish's face went pale. "It's a chase train." "What's that?" St. Jude asked. Catfish turned his back and started for the steam engine. "Trouble." By now the Germans had a better idea of what was going on and fired up at the roof. The first burst caught the 2 prisoners following Jean. The bullets tore up their legs. They fell onto the coach roof and rolled over into the dark waters of the Marne. Jean turned around, aimed down where the bullets came from, and fired his submachine gun. The other outlaws did the same, firing their guns blindly at the roof of the coach while running across it. St. Jude stumbled and fell through a patch of perforated wood. He threw the upper half of his body onto the top of the coach, kicking his feet to gain momentum, and pulled himself out. A soldier grabbed his legs to pull him down. St. Jude smashed the heel of his boot into the soldier's face. "Hold on," Jean said to St. Jude. He fired off a few bursts to discourage the soldiers. The MP40 jumped in his hands as the bullets flew between St. Jude's legs. "Careful," St. Jude yelled. "It's a big target." Jean shucked the empty magazine and slapped in a fresh one, letting out another long burst. Bonnie grabbed St. Jude's upper arm and lifted him over the edge of the hole. Once on his feet, St. Jude turned his own MP40 at the hole and fired off a few bursts. "I'll cover," St. Jude shouted to Jean. Jean nodded and led the way to the locomotive. The outlaws ran for it as bullets punched through the roof and whistled past them. Jean dove into the coal bin, sliding down to the engineer's compartment. Catfish and Bonnie soon followed with their charges. Catfish looked at Jean. "Take Hiccup down to the horses and get them ready to ride." Jean nodded. He jumped off the train, heaved Hiccup onto his shoulders, and took off down the cut. St. Jude stumbled along the top of the coaches while the bullets punched through the roof. He was halfway to the end of the last coach when a bullet blew off his foot. St. Jude fell hard on the roof of the coach. 2 more bullets punched through the roof and right out of him. The adrenaline was kicking in like wild horses. He picked himself up and stumbled down into the coal bin. Bonnie tore open St. Jude's bloody shirt. The bullets had torn through his guts, and he was bleeding out. Bonnie produced a small syringe of morphine and stuck St. Jude. He pulled out a bandage and wrapped it up as tight as he could to keep St. Jude's guts from spilling out. The Germans were gathering up to make a charge. Bullets snapped around them, ricocheting around the engineer's compartment. Catfish fired the Peacemaker, knocking down 2 soldiers that jumped up onto the roof, but the Germans were determined and kept on coming. Another howl came from the diesel. Catfish could feel the vibrations in the track. Bonnie looked at Catfish. "Connor and Goose will be pulling out soon. We have to get out of here." "We won't get far with the Boche on our backs," Catfish said. He looked at the engineer. "Make you a deal, monsieur? I let you and your firemen go if you boys get this iron horse in reverse." The engineer nodded. Catfish cut them loose and they got to work. He then knelt down next to St. Jude. St. Jude had his eyes closed and his breath was short. "Don't lie. It's bad, son." St. Jude gave a shallow chuckle. "Just my luck. Hand me a couple of those bullet sprayers. I'll keep the Boche off your tail. Just point me in the right direction." "You picked a bad time to become a hero," Catfish said. He tried to pick up St. Jude, but the dying outlaw could only groan. "That dope is only going to hold off so much pain," St. Jude said. He looked at Catfish with wide eyes. "I'm man enough to know the score." A smile crept across his face. "I just hope I don't go to heaven for this." The gears of the steam locomotive came back to life. The train started to lurch backwards, slowly picking up steam and speed. The engineer and the fireman jumped down and ran into the night. Bonnie fired off the last rounds from his MP40, slapped a fresh magazine in it, and charged the bolt. He handed St. Jude the gun, saluted, and jumped off the train, taking the dapper prisoner with him. St. Jude took the gun and smiled. "Tell Jean I'm sorry. Tell him..." St. Jude's voice trailed away. "I'll tell him," Catfish said. The locomotive was almost on the bridge. Catfish handed St. Jude a second MP40 and pointed him at the coal bin. "Best I ever worked with," Catfish said. "See you across the Jordan." Catfish jumped off just as the engine cleared the bridge. The Germans took advantage of the short lull in fire and rushed the engineer's compartment. The first wave caught a long burst from St. Jude. They returned fire. The train was chugging backwards, inhaling fire and exhaling steam, going faster and faster towards the trace train. The Germans, desperate now, charged one last time into the guns. St. Jude pulled the triggers and laughed. Jean stumbled towards the horses under the burden of Hiccup and his own fears. Moo ran over to Jean. "My God," she said, "what's going on up there?" "A gunfight," Jean said. "You think the goddamn Boche were going to hand over the prisoners?" Moo said nothing. There was a rustle in the bushes and some of the horses snickered. Jean swung the MP40 into his hands. "Don't shoot," Goose said. He and Connor walked towards them. Jean slung the MP40 onto his shoulder. "Help me with Hiccup." They were able to get Hiccup onto Catfish's horse. The poor man was so banged up he could hardly keep the saddle. "Get the rest of the horses ready," Jean said. The men nodded, and Jean ran back up the cut. "Sean," Moo screamed, but he kept running up the spur. Moo ran after him. In the darkness, Jean ran into Bonnie carrying the dapper prisoner. "Where's Catfish?" Jean asked. Bonnie grabbed Jean. "He's right behind me along with the Jerrys. Go back to the horses." Jean shrugged off Bonnie's hand and kept running. He got to the top of the tracks where Catfish was running towards him. "Where's St. Jude?" Jean said. "He's gone." The sound of gunfire and laughter issued from the backward-moving locomotive. Jean sprinted for the train. Moo came up on the tracks running after Jean with the MP40 strapped across her chest. "Jean! Jean!" she screamed after him. But Jean kept running for the train. Two soldiers jumped out from the bottom of the trestle and pointed their guns up at Jean. Moo screamed so loud that Jean turned his head and saw the soldiers getting the drop on him. Before he could handle the trigger on his own submachine gun, a burst of gunfire rang out and the Germans were cut down. The submachine gun bucked in Moo's arms, spitting out fire and throwing empty brass. The smell of the burnt powder stung her nose, and the roar filled her ears. Her whole body shook from the recoil, while tears leaked out of the corner of her shut eyes. Seconds later, the gun went click. Jean turned his back on the train and ran towards Moo. The gun shook in her hands. Her eyes were still closed. Jean took Moo in his arms. She screamed out, "Why did you leave me?" "I'm sorry," Jean said, holding on to her shaking body. Moo put her face in Jean's chest and started to cry. Jean held her tight. Down the tracks, the chase train blew its whistle. Moo could feel Jean's tears wetting her forehead. Moo looked up at Jean. For a moment there was no war or death, just sorrow. Jean kissed her full and long as their tears mingled on each other's cheeks. Moo wrapped her arms around Jean, holding him tight. A large explosion rocked the valley of the Marne and lit up the night sky.
And welcome back to the Strange West podcast. Once again, this is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tonner. Well, that about does it for tonight's Cowboys vs. Nazi action in Chapter 24 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trent Tonner. Can't wait to find out what happens next? Then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are also available at Society6.com/TrentTano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. And once again, a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. And sending us out, as always, with their rendition of Eno Marconi's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like what you hear, please check them out at MitchPolzak.com. Well, that about does it for tonight's podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Until then, happy trails.